All right. Oh, I gotta think of it. Sorry, guys. I didn't think All right. Sorry. So the last big piece about guidelines versus deed restrictions is they're not law or code. They're actually most likely going to be adopted. Well, actually, it will be by the city and county as a resolution and not as an ordinance. So they won't be codified, and that makes them amendable as they move forward. So tonight, if we make a decision, we're not going to make a decision tonight, but as the council and BOCC make decisions on the adoption of these, that we actually, when I did this in Crestview, we actually revisited our guidelines every 2 years. We just made it common practice, come in, take a look at them, see how they're working, if there was any issues with the lottery process or resale or something along those lines, we came back and revisit those. That's important because you don't, if you have to change it as code, then you gotta go through the whole codification process. Next slide. So it's really important that when I say it's bendable, how are they used? And I think that's probably the hardest thing to wrap your head around the document, a community, when you see it, it's like, you start reading through it and go, well, if you're a developer, this won't fit my project. Like, I'm only targeting 80% AMI folks, and you're gonna allow 120%. My state funding wouldn't allow that. What's gonna happen? Oh my goodness, it's gonna end the road. No. The way it works is that we can actually mold and adapt, but they serve as a guideline. Where they will be most impactful, though, are when the city and the county or another public entity that's located in Lake County develop property and do it in your own. That's where the guidelines probably take the most precedent moving forward, is because you guys as the policymakers have said, these are all the folks that qualify for our housing. And that's really important to also think about when you're an elected here in the room or on Zoom tonight, is how does that influence the guidelines about the prioritization of applicants moving forward? If it's county-owned, city-owned, or school district-owned land, how do we ensure that our employees are taken care of? Who do we want to prioritize moving forward on those? It doesn't mean that it completely, and guidelines need to be inclusive, not exclusive, right? So fair housing law dictates that everyone is available, but you can prioritize who it goes to in there. When you talk about private development or public-private partnerships, those two are when we start to bend the guidelines, right? And we start to use certain pieces. A private developer is most likely going to use the lottery process, number one. They're going to want a housing authority or whoever's qualifying the applicants to step in and to allow them to not have to process applicants for sale units, for instance. So they would love to have 20 applicants for a 10-unit development so that they know it's going to pre-sell, they're going to have people under contract, and they can get those units sold once they close out. It also matters sometimes for rental projects if they don't fall into like the light tech model. The developer would love to have somebody come in and pre-qualify folks if there's AMI caps to ensure that applicants that are applying for rental housing meet the qualifications for the project. So those are times when a public-private partnership can go in there. The final big one is resale of for sale property. The resale procedures, the permitted capital improvements, those play heavy for a future buyer as they go to sell their home if they move out of the community. That's really important. The community guidelines are really instrumental in that. And those are some of the things we're going to talk about tonight to try to get some direction. Next slide. So what is a deed restriction? The deed restriction is a legal document. This, I can tell you that today, I couldn't even help draft you a deed restriction because unless the attorneys were in the room and they were looking over my shoulder word for word, they are ultimately going to pen the final deed restriction. And each of those deed restrictions, because they're actually recorded against the property, are going to be different because they're going to have separate legal descriptions for that property, etc. They could be restrictive or as lenient as the decision makers want them to be. And that's really important because that's where it differs from the guidelines. But once those decisions are made, they're made in perpetuity. So if you say, we are going to make a decision on, say, occupancy, income, residency, and resale, those are going to be the ones that apply into the future for the future buyer. cap appreciations, etc. When I was in Crested Butte, I had 9 different deed restrictions that I had to administer. They were all different depending on the properties. Some were just that they had to be a local resident in a house. Some were to the point where we restricted their total income, the amount of assets they could have, to the point of also what they could sell the unit into the future. So it really depends, and honestly, the way that's decided is based on the amount of subsidy that you normally put into a unit. The more subsidy normally equals, that's not 100%, but normally equals a higher, more restricted deed restriction, because you want to protect the long-term value in the property. But again, normally it's dictated by the funder. I will tell you that, like, for any state or federal project that receives funding, they have their own deed restrictions. They will bring those to the table and those will be required. The state's a little bit more lenient on allowing local deed restrictions, but they have certain requirements. For instance, if they have an 80% AMI cap for a rental, they will want to see that language and they will review the deed restriction and make sure that it's in there. But this stays in perpetuity with the property. Next slide. All right, so there is a current draft. The community guidelines, there was a meeting, Christy, when did we do that meeting? It was July 2021.
2020, I don't know. One of the years. It was in July.
I want to be clear to everyone, the reason we didn't send out that draft tonight is there's a lot of blanks in currently as it's conceived. However, the great thing about that document is it's gotten us way down the road on a lot of decisions around best practices, because the Housing Coalition did do a lot of research and did the hard work of making sure that we're following best practices. And so those types of decisions you'll see in the draft, and I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time. Again, we're not having to reinvent the wheel. You guys are blessed of having a bunch of communities that have robust affordable housing programs that we were able to go and look at. So, permitted capital improvements, for instance, that's one of the things that we just took right from another community and were able to put in. Certainly, those are things that the council and the BOCC want to look at as a complete draft. But as we discuss these tonight, we're really relying heavily on best practices of other communities. Next slide.
I have a quick question.
Sure.
Have you also gone to those communities and said what's working, what's not?
Yeah, so we had Lori Best, who's been doing this work for about 30 years and has produced all of the affordable housing in Breckenridge in the last 30 years, come and tell us exactly what went wrong, what she wished she would have done differently, and why.
Sweet, thank you.
No problem. And like I said, I think it's going to be really imperative, and this is good as this slide, how they're adopted. Again, by adopting the guidelines as resolutions, that makes them available to go back and revisit and re-update. And if in the future we decide to go to like a regional housing authority to oversee the guidelines, their board can actually make the recommendations and amend them. So that's what makes them. Now, a deed restriction is not amendable. It is not amendable in any way except if you, at the transfer of the property a second time, you can actually repeal and replace the deed restriction, but you have to do it in its entirety. It is a pain in the butt. And the other thing about deed restrictions is the only thing that makes a deed restriction go away is a foreclosure, and that's what the banks require on them. And we can get into the minutia of that in meeting 2, because that's actually why we need to know who's enforcing the deed restriction, because they have the ability to step in and potentially save the deed restriction. But that's why it's really important that we get there in meeting 2. But again, deed restrictions are actually a property interest that's held by either the city, county, or a future housing board that actually protects the affordability in perpetuity. Any questions between the two differences in the room? What about on Zoom?
I think the only thing I didn't hear you say is the deed restriction does refer to the community guidelines.
Yes. So yeah, so that's a great point, Christy. Deed restrictions will have a phrase that's called a qualified applicant or qualified buyer that needs to occupy the unit. That qualified, it'll say as defined by the guidelines. So you're right. The deed restriction will reference the guidelines, but a good deed restriction will say the guidelines as may be amended. But we're not listening. The hard way. Finally, this is meeting two. This is a really, really important question about who actually enforces the enforceability. Again, when we start talking about how we set up a program to take care of deed restrictions and administer them, that will get into the governance structure of a potential regional housing board if that's the decision we decide to move forward with. All right, next slide. All right, so is there anybody on Zoom that did not get the policymaker? I have one. It seems like the city of Leadville's email did not, or is not allowing this for some reason. So I'm gonna send it one more time to Ward 3. It's coming your way.
When you sent it earlier, Michael, it came in as a folder with dozens of files.
Are you guys? Oh wow, you guys probably got my whole. Sorry, guys. How was that? Are you able to see that now?
Nope, I'm getting the same thing. I'm not getting a new document. Let me go to the top here. Oh, let me look at this.
Yeah, if you're in the chat and you click on the latest one,
Yeah,
does it just open up a Word file?
it opens up an entire folder with probably, well, now that I look at it, way over 50 files.
Okay.
I don't know, is that what everybody else is seeing?
This is Chris. I'm just getting the couple of page document that I think Michael's intending to send.
This is Lori, and I'm getting the same folder that the mayor is getting with a whole bunch of documents in it.
This is, I don't see anything either in the chat or in my city email.
Okay, so Tim, I'm gonna send it to Tim. Tim's gonna send it to everybody's email here in just a second. Can you send it to the group?
Yeah, I'm just gonna send it to their calendar.
Okay. Cool. And I can actually just open this. Jackie can. In case you can't see it, so we can keep moving here. All right. So that last slide really gets into, there's really 4 kind of key things that I want to talk about tonight as far as looking for policy direction from the room tonight. And how are we doing on time real quick? We're good? 6:31. Well, on that. So these first 2 actually are probably the most difficult and are going to require the most input from the room. And it's really the who qualifies for housing. the first question and the way that most communities look at their potential assets in land development are what's defined as an essential service provider. And if you think about it, it's really the folks that look out for the health and welfare of your community. It's normally things that, again, this isn't an exclusive list, but governance, emergency healthcare, fire, police protection, basic sanitation, including water, sewer, and garbage removal. And when you think about that, it's what does your community take to open its doors every day and continue to function? And I think you can add into that list that school districts are also probably high on the list. And you can see kind of a draft list. There was a great comment that was added today about early childhood providers. Is there an actual district on that, or are they individual schools? Is some of the schools? Yeah.
There is some provided via the school district, there's other providers in county. They're not a taxing authority. But anybody in this room with small children would say that they're essential for the rest of us to show up anywhere.
Yeah. I can believe
Especially
that.
given the last 2 years.
And I think we can add early childhood in this very easy. Is there any other major folks that I missed on this list that you think as policymakers you want to ensure are on that list as far as districts or anything else?
That bottom one's supposed to be Twin Lakes, or is there actually a 3 lakes?
They call it 3 lakes. It's all the way.
Oh, is that attached to one of the main technical parks?
Huh?
Is that attached to Mountain Valley Estates? Or-
No, that's the operator of Twin Lakes and then the hydro. That's the third lake. What's that one called? See? Postal Service. Is that one we wanted to add? Yeah, and I was gonna ask, is the sheriff and the police both under the city and county? So they would count.
Oh, gotcha, yeah.
But that's a good one, Tim. Is there any other ones that are out there?
One sort of nuances like county cost shares on some positions that are shared with other non-governmental entities.
So would you?
Like we have a CSU extension agent that we cost share at 5 office space for. I'm not advocating one way or the other, just pointing out that people do like, are they like county employees? Like actually in some cases, no. But we're putting resources into them. And I just, yeah.
No, that's a great one. And what's interesting is that someone like that could potentially, as we get into this, Jeff, they could actually file a grievance.
Yeah.
And that board could make the decision on obviously their argument would be that I'm fine with that county. That's a good one. The postal service was added. What's the advocates for Lake County and other nonprofits? All right, let's have a discussion about that. So that's where this really rubber hits the road. Is do you want to start in your essential employees to go into adding in all the additional nonprofits? And as a policymaker, here's how I want you to think about this decision. They are going to qualify in the tiers as employed and working in Lake County. So it's not that they don't qualify. It's when we get into these tiers, should they be prioritized over somebody that potentially runs the different districts around the town? And so you can see this is why these first two are going to really take a lot of brain power today. And I don't want everyone to get tripped up by it, because believe me, I've spent an entire 2-hour city council meeting on this word, this essential definition. So and so that's really what I'm looking for from direction is, do we want to include those additional nonprofits as essential? Now, I'm not saying they're not important, but really it comes down to, you got to remember that when the guidelines really full force apply, it's going to be when we use city, county, or other pieces of property that are controlled publicly, right? And how do you ensure that those 50 listings that you currently have on your job boards are you're being able to put employees into into those housing units when you're leveraging your own property, right?
You also have to think about Jackie administering this, like,
Yeah.
we have a list of like 60 folks that we consider essential. How feasible is it for Jackie to actually do this for us?
I was just gonna say, like, some of the, like, the forest services in the chat there, I'm wondering about transportation, but again, like.
Yep, so let's, I'm gonna jump down to the tiers, but I wanna ask one other really, really important question. And because it's you guys, the other really tough decision that I want some direction on before we get into the tiers, because it helps guide the tier discussion, is do we want to prioritize Lake County employees, so folks that work in Lake County, over commuters that live in Lake County but work outside of the county? And that is a huge policy discussion because it was 75 or 65 or 75? 75% commute out. And so that's another really big policy consideration when you start ranking folks. And so as we go down, so let's scroll down to the tiers. That's a really important decision for folks to think about. So if you can put perfect. Okay. So right now I have basically two tiered versions that are option 1 and option 2. The only difference between the two tiers that you're seeing on your screen is whether or not tier 1 is basically any essential service provider employee. And that's option 2. Option 1 allows any Lake County employee making less than 120% AMI. As well, obviously, you're an essential, at that point, if you're an essential service provider, you work in Lake County, so you qualify in tier 1. It just has that AMI cap on it, right? That is really the only quintessential difference in these two lists between tier 1 and tier 2. And I think from a policymaker's decision guide, that is really, I mean, this is where you really have to put your thinking cap on and make a decision. Do you want to prioritize essential service providers first? Because that means that, for instance, a city planner who makes more than 120% AMI, who's moving into town and takes a job, is in tier 2, right? Versus a teacher or an administrator at the school district who makes more than 120% AMI, they don't get in the first round of a lottery for housing. So that's really and
I would just say, like, my first reaction to that is there aren't 20 planner jobs. Like, once you fill those, the idea is to retain those. And so you're filled, you can then serve the community maximize the service to the community. And hopefully that tier 1, if those were to be switched, tier 1's met rather quickly. And maybe, you often skip it to tier 2 if there are qualified honor folks.
Yep.
Applying.
Yeah, so let's talk about how, so great question. So how does this all function, right? So let's do a hypothetical, say we have a project that has 20 units that is being built. Again, this would be a city or county or school district property that we're leveraging, right? Because the guidelines full force are in effect here. And then this scenario, so say we have 20 units and we only had 15 applicants at first, right? So we say we have 25, sorry, bad example. We have 20 units, we have 25 applicants. The first 10 applicants are essential service providers, right? They work for one of the entities we just discussed. They would automatically get a dib at a unit. Now that we would still go through a lottery process.
And this is option 2, right?
This would be option 2.
Thank you.
Yeah. We'd still go through a lottery process because someone might want the corner lot versus the middle lot, right? And then any leftover units would go to tier 2. So folks that are employees in Lake County making less than 200 or 120% AMI would be 2. Employees working in Lake County making about, oh, my touch the screen. I forgot. The state does that. Sorry, I touched the screen. My bad.
I do.
Here, I'll do it. You keep talking.
I have no idea what I did. Thank you. Sorry, I'll touch the screen. Smarter than me. Employees, again, anyone residing in Lake County that works in Lake County, 120% AMI would be the second tier. If you make over 120% AMI, the third tier. A Lake County resident, so you could be a telecommuter, would be tier 4. And then the last one is if there's any leftover units, any other permanent resident. And so it would go through, as you administer, you would go through and assign that prioritization in the lottery, right? You, as a general rule of, you want to have more, any developer who is building a for sale product wants basically 50% more applicants than they have units. That really makes their bank feel warm and fuzzy about lending on the project. And so that is kind of a rule that a lot of lenders want to see. But I don't expect a decision tonight. Yep, go ahead.
I have a question.
Sure.
We could go through a scenario.
Yep.
So what I've learned is, and maybe I'm wrong, but if you could clarify, so if you are renting an affordable unit, you have to qualify for those deed restrictions on an annual basis. You have to continually qualify for those deed restrictions on rentals. Whereas if you are purchasing a property and you only have to meet those qualifications, let's say AMI, you only have to be at or below AMI up until the time of closing.
That's correct.
So wouldn't the same thing be applicable to someone coming here, applying for a job in our county, being sold at one of our affordable housing, and then going and applying for a job out of county that pays them more?
They could do that as long as they occupy the unit as their permanent residence.
Correct, but then it's no longer, if you're qualifying people over jobs, over people that have lived in the community, you are risking still losing houses to people outside of the community, working outside of the community.
So on a for sale product, I appreciate the question. On a for sale product, the issue you will always run into on that exact, what you just brought up, is that you have to remember that when you sell somebody a home, the first goal should always be their success in that unit, right? They're building equity, everything. If they are able to better themselves because they got into permanent housing and are able to get a better job but remain a Lake County resident, that's just the reality of that situation. Now,
Unless you prioritize people that live here equally with people that have jobs here.
Even they could get a different job after that.
Correct, but people that have lived in this community that pay their taxes here, their kids are in our schools. Lack of housing and housing insecurity disproportionately affects children in health, in mental health, physical health. All outcomes can be affected by the basic need for housing. And so if you were to, if families here with kids here were able to acquire affordable housing, don't you think that they would more than likely try to be able to find a job in this community where they could attend their kids' sporting events? I don't know, it seems like that should be equally prioritized in our community, just considering the demographics.
so save that bookmark that, because that's a great thought. And the reason I'm gonna tell you to bookmark that is we're gonna get into lottery picks in a little bit. I think that starts to kind of address, because lottery picks are based on how many, you get so many picks for how many years you live here. So when you talk about someone that has been here and worked in your community for 5 or 10 years, they're gonna have better chances of receiving a unit over someone who just relocated here.
Correct.
So that, but to really address your I think there's two pieces that you spoke to. So that's the one piece that I wanted to make sure. But the resale and the requirements of that, you could, I wouldn't recommend it, but on a deed restriction, the deed restriction could say that you need to be a qualified occupant. And if someone took a job outside of the county and that under the deed restriction said that you cannot do that, you must work in Lake County, then they could be forced to sell. But what I would recommend is that is not a situation. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, the action plan, for those of you who aren't aware, the action plan specifically, kind of addresses this, and it recommends that because of our low capacity for administering these type of things, and because of 75% of the people resident, workforce working out of county, that, we should start with a more encompassing, process, because when you have all these rules, and we don't have administration for it, we have no one to enforce it, it gets super complicated.
So we will have, just to be off, big transparency, if you don't have a Jackie to administer your lotteries, you don't have a housing program. And that is the whole purpose of today, is to create, and I'll be honest with you, I'm a big believer in the KISS system, keep it simple, stupid. I 100% agree with you on that. We'll get into some of the more complicated ways of doing calculus for resales in a 2% model or 3% model, which I would recommend. So I agree with you. What it really comes down to, and again, what you have to kind of keep thinking through is you have a very limited amount of potential leverage that you have in the form of land in this community. And if you're going to leverage that, especially if you're going to leverage public lands, that tiered system is what we need to consider. And this is for all intents and purposes, this came out, tier 1 came out of the housing coalition as part of the action plan and everything.
Well, that was, it was also a template from another community, but what I'm trying to ask is for our elected officials, making these big decisions, to really, really think about like our specific communities.
So on that note, I also wanted to add that I feel like a lot of our Latino folks don't work here, and that 70% of our school students are Latina, meaning their parents are usually mostly not working in town. Now, there's other ways that we can help solve that problem independent of this, but to stick with this, I think it's important for the time being that we really focus on making sure that they have a equitable reach to really start building their own equity for their own kids as well. Largely, one of the biggest problems that I've seen with people sticking around, and this is something that everyone always complains about, is that our kids are leaving the community real fast, is that they don't really have a place to stay because there's 17 people in one trailer park, in one trailer house, and that's unmanageable. And the second that you can have an opportunity, you probably will. So really incentivizing everyone to say, yeah, we should prioritize that community as much as local workers, I think is extremely important. And I know I definitely will be staying on that point, because it feels wrong to, what I see it as like a punish them for not being able to work here because it's not enough pay, or maybe they don't have the experience that they need to get jobs here, or whatever it is. And then also turn around and say, well, our kids should be staying here, and it's unfortunate they're leaving, and having all these issues. So I really think we should incentivize having those two at the same tier. I don't see why we would separate in town at the, for the time. And, if that changes in the future where more people in town or in community are working within the community, then maybe we can adapt those changes. But for the time being, it makes no equitable sense for our Latina community to have that differentiation.
I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, I'm good. Go ahead. Or I think Mayor had his hand up as well.
Whoever wants, you wanna go? Greg, you wanna go? I'll call Greg.
I have a couple thoughts. Thank you. The first is, we focus on 120% AMI, and I get very confused about what the opportunity for using 140% is. But my question is, could we, in the tiers, and I know the tiers can get very complicated, say that anybody who works, well, I'll just use it as an example, for the city or county, can qualify at 140% AMI. That's the first thought. And tell me if that's just not even possible.
No, that's the AMIs, which you'll see on the decision-making guide down below are there for references. The AMIs are flexible. The reason for 120%, Greg, is that up until this year, that has typically been the max cap that the state funders would allow. So that's where the 120 comes from, is that normally if you take state funding for a project, that's where they will, the cap
Yes,
at.
but I had heard the state had raised the AMI to 140%, but that's the part where I get confused.
You're correct, and I think what you're seeing here is literally within a year of us writing this, is a change in the state.
Okay. My second question, and this may have been discussed before, but the discussions have been all over the place, so I may have lost track. I mean, I get real heartburn when people who live here and work here take their kids out of these schools. I know it might sound absurd, but I wouldn't mind seeing that as a tier qualifier for people who have their kids in our schools.
The only issue with that, and that's a great question, Greg, is that when you start to talk about family, when you start to talk about family households, requiring someone to have a child is something that you cannot tier. So that's where you.
But it wouldn't be a requirement, it would just be one of the ways you could qualify for a tier.
I would warn you that as a guy who does not have children, if you prioritize household size is one of those, it's like race, religion, household size. Those are the types of things where you want to stay very clear to keep yourself. You can do it on income, but when you start, I'm just giving you the.
I don't think I was suggesting that the tier would be that you have to have children, but if you did have children, I don't know. I'm just thinking out loud. I know it probably wouldn't work, but that's just one of those things that I have as a pet peeve.
And Greg, one thing that where you can, so we're really getting the weeds here, but that's okay. Where you can, again, remember, these are the guardrails, right? And so we might have a specific project where you have a 3-bedroom, 2-bath. And you could require that the minimum household size to occupy a 3-bed, 2-bath. So you don't get a single guy like myself buying the 3-bed, 2-bath and having parties and having my own, I don't know what I do, a gym in one room or something. I don't work out. So that doesn't work. But the point is, you can for certain units require a minimum household size. So again, I want everyone to remember, again, these are just your overarching policies, right, as we proceed. And this helps, actually, in every lottery I ever did, we actually created a set tier for that lottery and published it for any of our projects. So everyone knew what the rules were, because it depended on what money I took from wherever I got it from to make that project happen, that it dictated that I couldn't allow anyone over 120 or 140% to qualify. If we didn't take funding, I was allowed up to 200% of the money. And so that's really where it comes in. But again, when you sit again, and I appreciate the fact that this is the hardest discussion that we're gonna have today, so I want to spend the time on it. It really gets into this equity lens. And it's fine to have these conversations. This is the conversation I want to have tonight, because it's the hardest piece of it when you talk about housing or affordable housing. So
one thing I would just like to add before, I leave it to y'all, was the community fund, the Unmet Needs Committee gave over $600,000 to over 700 families in our community for housing costs and things like that throughout COVID. I mean, these are our families that are housing insecure and, living in houses with so many people and overcrowding. And I just would really urge the elected officials to prioritize people that have lived here over 5 years. Like I said, their taxes go here, their kids are in our schools. If you could give them equal prioritization, you could dramatically affect the outcomes of these kids' futures and lives more than you could by getting them a good teacher. That's my piece.
Can we consider multiple criteria for a tier? So, and here's my example.
Sure.
So we're talking about resident commuters and potentially like, maybe it's got a time requirement, like it says 12 months here, but you know, it could be 5 years, it could be 2 years, whatever it is. Could tier 2, for example, be, you know, Lake County essential service providers making above 120% AMI, or Lake County resident of 5 years or more, and they would be in the same lottery today.
You can, but what I would tell you about years in the valley is to actually do that as picks, additional picks. So if I've been here for 20 years and you've been here for 2, we'll get into that tonight. That's one of the things that's on the decision-making guide. It's at page 2 if you want to flip to that. That allows for the folks that have spent more time and have paid more taxes to have a better opportunity. So that's literally, I have 8 picks in a bucket of numbers and you have 2.
But they would be getting 8 picks in tier
1. Depends on where they,
or like saying, so it's a resident commuter, been here for 10 years. They would get a bunch of picks, but they would get a bunch of picks in tier 4.
correct.
And so
Under-
I'm proposing that we bump them up in the tiers.
So I have one slight question,
Sure.
just for understanding. Would this have any inclusion on what their general assets are, like their net
Yes.
worth and all that? Because that seems like it could be, you know, someone who is older may not have a full time, may work and may qualify for one of these, might want to just buy a house, but they have plenty of equity already.
There
Feels
are
available.
definitely asset limits.
Okay.
And those are, I will tell you that just go with the best practices of the other communities. It's normally 3 times the AMI that they can have as assets. And what that does is it typically precludes somebody that currently has housing as equity in a housing to basically sell a $1 million house to move into a $200,000 house. But that is a best practice one. I would highly recommend that you look at your peers and kind of stick with them on that and not deviate too far, because that one has been played out time after time. But yes, there are assets.
And Brett online is also asking questions. If you stand.
Yeah, Brent, sorry, not Brett.
Hey, thank you much. Something I'd like to throw in there, you know, as we're talking about workforce housing, you know, the folks that I'm trying to hire that, you know, would hit in this 120%, you know, if I'm trying to bring them from outside the community, what tier do they wind up at? And it sounds like all of this is really focused on folks that are already here. And so as for me, you know, being one of the larger employers trying to recruit, that this really isn't a program that would help me recruit, because I wouldn't be able, you know, when these come up, I wouldn't be able to use that as a tool to say, hey, you might be able to qualify for this. Am I understanding that correct?
Nope. So you would, and in tier 1, the hospital district, if you remember our first conversation, Brett, the hospital district was listed as an essential service provider. And in the tier 1, and we'll get into the lottery picks.
This is for option 1 or option 2?
It actually wouldn't matter on either one.
Okay.
Okay.
But Brett, what's important is when we get into lottery picks, most communities give at least one additional lottery pick to essential service workers.
That's my question. Okay.
Yeah, and actually the draft that was recommended out of the Housing Coalition was actually 2 additional picks, and that's what allowed essential service providers in tier 1 to actually have a little bit of an edge on the way tier 1 is absent the second option, which puts essential service providers first.
Got it. Because it'd be the same sort of thing for the school district as they're trying to bring in additional teachers, or, you know, for our childcare, you know, pieces that we're trying to get up and going as well. So I appreciate that explanation. Thank you.
And Brett, one last big piece is if you see that asterisk on the screen that says or special first right of refusal. And I want to explain that because I think that's really important, because when we start to talk again about how we structure projects, for instance, if the hospital district had a piece of land that they gave to a housing authority to develop as a hypothetical, and say you were able to build 8 units on that piece of land, the hospital district, as that land donation, could say 50% of those units are going to be prioritized for hospital district employees first.
Got it.
So again, keep in mind that this is guardrails, right? This isn't laws.
Right.
This has to be flexible. You guys, the minutia you're getting into is a beautiful example of how messy everybody's housing situation is. And poor Jackie.
Exactly.
How to deal with this.
So I think one of the things I'm struggling with, are we looking for broad community housing or are we looking for housing for essential services? And I think which option we choose will steer it. Am I understanding that differentiation?
Well, here's a lifelong affordable housing lesson. This is the one thing that I will tell you that if you set out to try to solve all of your housing problems with every one project you do, you will never be successful. Every project that you build will be targeted to certain audiences.
Okay.
And so, for instance, again, if you leverage a certain piece of property, you could say, like, as a school district, say it's a school district piece of property, the school district could say, we want to target our employees first. You can do that how we structure it, but what's important is, as you know, Paul, if he has somebody come in as an HR, you know, in the HR department and says, how come so-and-so got the house and I didn't? You need to be able to point back to the guidelines and say, this is how we conducted the lottery.
This is how we conducted the lottery and these were the number of picks you got versus that person. So their odds were better, or your odds were better and they just happened to be lucky.
Light bulb, yes.
I have one more thing to add to that.
Yep.
Many of you reached out to me today asking clarifying questions, and I'm not quite sure who I talked to about this with, but someone asked me explicitly, what are we trying to solve here? Are we trying to solve workforce or are we trying to solve equity? And my suggestion to you guys would be, equity is not easy work. If it was, everyone would be doing it. So when we are doing something that is economic and we have the opportunity to tie in equity, we should. That is why I think it is important to be having these robust conversations about who we are serving.
And this is, I mean, what you guys are talking about tonight is the quintessential. This is why we're starting at A, who qualifies, right? That is why we need to take one giant step back from the last conversation we had and really kind of focus in on who is the qualifying folks and what is our mission? Because this is the north arrow, right? This is like, what are we trying to do as a community? Again, each project is going to change a little bit as we proceed. But when we go, we shouldn't have to start we shouldn't have to do this imagine doing this for every single build. You won't have a developer ever build housing in your community if they have 10 meetings like this. So.
Can I ask a clarifying question? Can you have different guidelines for rental affordable units than
Yes.
you do for purchasing?
You absolutely can, actually you will.
Because it seems like, you know, if you prioritize workforce housing, because I'll tell you, like that's me. I'm a renter. I'm housing insecure here. I work for Lake County. I could be advocating for myself here, but I am trying to advocate for the marginalized community.
It's okay to advocate for yourself.
And so, you know, that's why I think it's really important for the people that, anyhow, back to my question. If you were to prioritize people that had jobs here for rentals, that could help for someone to transplant here, get a job, you know, and have housing. Whereas if you prioritize people who have lived here for purchase for houses that, so could you do something like that? Could you structure the guidelines where for purchase homes, people who have lived here and have families here could take priority?
So again, it goes back to, the answer to that is, it goes right back to the lottery picks, how you prioritize years in the valley. That's kind of, I'll say that's best practice, is to give them additional lottery picks. You have to, if they fit in one of those tiers, they have to at least have a chance, no matter how many years they've had.
Well, so I'm wondering if the renter guidelines are the same as the buyer's guidelines?
So rentals, let's talk about rentals. So your question, I think, around is how do rentals work?
Well,
Yeah,
just trying to tell,
Sure.
them,
no problem. Actually, the way rentals work is there's not normally a lottery for rentals, because rentals turn up, right? And rentals are more based on qualifying applicants. So do you check the boxes to fit into the rental, that unit? Unfortunately, the real unfortunate piece about rentals is if you take any external funding for rentals, that it won't matter what these guidelines say, the external funder is going to very much dictate who a qualified applicant is for the rental.
is that like light tech?
Light 100%, they actually won't care two bits about any of this stuff.
What's that?
Low income, affordable, no income housing tax credits.
Thank you.
And that actually, those projects are 60% AMI or less. And they won't, it doesn't matter if you showed up here 20 minutes ago, or you've been here for 20 years, the way they have their own qualifications for the housing. So.
So the other projects like from DOH, they're more along the lines of 80% EMI and you won't even get approved for that funding until you have like a wait list of folks who are ready.
But to answer your question, so here's a unique circumstance where these guidelines come into play is, for instance, we had actually employer rentals where businesses were allowed to purchase. So they made the developer whole at the end of the developer built it. They actually had a for sale product, but the employer bought it and then rented back to their employees. That's when these types of procedures and rules come into play. And that's really based on the occupancy of the unit, et cetera, et cetera.
So section 10, we've got also, Tracey is asking.
Sarah.
Sarah. Yeah.
Okay, for clarification, the requirements of meeting the AMI, is that for an individual? So that there's a guarantee that at least someone is paying a mortgage? I just wanted to make
Yeah,
sure
so
that
if you
that's
look up.
clear and it's not a household, 'cause then you get into,
It is based on
it
household.
is the household.
It is on the household. And if you look at AMI, and this is my big gripe with AMIs, is that actually when you start talking about a two income household, these AMIs don't jump up for 2 incomes. And I do not like that the entire housing room is based on AMIs. That's my own personal gripe. No one listens to me, so I can stop there. But
But my other question, and that is kind of leading me to thinking like the guarantee or the safety of whoever is placed in the house. Because if we're talking about what we are subsidizing today in the next project versus who we are actually like, who are we clearly not serving in our first project? Anyone below, 100 AMI? Or what, like, because then that might not be the answer, but if we want to serve anybody lower, I mean, it's not, like, at what point is it not actually, what's the word I'm looking for? Like, you can't
subsidize it.
have home ownership well, yeah, I mean, we'd have to subsidize a lot so that somebody who's making that low salary can afford that really low mortgage then.
So when you're
And
hitting,
what can we afford right now
Yeah.
in the project that we're,
so you're hitting on the key to why these are guardrails and not law, right? Because if you can imagine trying to tell a developer that they need to build a house at 80% AMI, and the person can only afford $120,000 house, and you can't even build a home just for the sticks and the labor at 120, and it costs you 250, the developer will never build it and will never have any housing. So your point there is very true to,
Yeah.
true. What happens is, what happens in a project is you'll actually wind up saying, we'll have 5 homes that will allow 200% AMI that we can charge 350,000 for, and we'll be able to have 4 homes at 80% AMI or less. Those 4 homes at 80% AMI or less are your kind of like goal that you want to protect, and then where the guidelines really come into full force, because you guys have subsidized those units substantially, and you want to protect the affordability of those units. Not that the 200% AMIs you don't care about, but if somebody is able to, say they only make 140% AMI, but are able to afford a $350,000 home, that doesn't preclude them, right? So again, you're getting into the nuances of the reality of how this plays out. I love the questions. I mean, it's just it just truly is like, I can tell you, I'd be lying to the whole room if I told you that I've ever had a project like follow the guidelines 100%. It just doesn't happen. But the thing is, when we sit down and as policymakers, when the council or BOCC sits down and says, we have a block of land and we want to build housing on it. What you as a policymaker want to be able to do is say, we want to follow X in the guidelines. Staff, go figure it out. What you don't want to do as policymakers is have to sit there and go, unit 1, I think we're going to do a teacher that's 120% AMI or less. Unit 2, wait, did our math, wait, okay. It just doesn't work that way. That's why these serve as the guardrails to allow your development community to come in and create a housing package that fits in this. And then when they offer it out to the community, everyone knows what the rules are, right? Around lotteries, resales, how it all works. Yay, we're getting some light bulbs
Can
tonight.
I make an AMI clarification? I could argue that if we had more robust childcare in our community, that we would have higher AMI ranges for bigger households.
Yes.
And AMI, when we get into, you're
I
getting
mean, I just think if we.
When you have Tracy's questions.
Yes, you bet. Tracy, that is a great question. You can tap, most communities tap affordable housing at 200% AMI. I would encourage you in your first round of looking at this to cap AMIs at 200% AMI. If you look, again, at the quick reference, what that means for a household. Unfortunately, in today's market, as Chaffee pointed out, there's 3 homes that are under $700,000 right now. The reality is that family at over 200% AMI is likely not going to qualify. What I will say though, as policymakers and as you look at your essential, again, going back to the term essential workforce, I hate to say that, but when you think through that lens, and I think that's really important for the council and the school board and for the BOC to be thinking about, when you think about those folks that keep the lights on, they're under 200% AMI. You're high. I mean, you know what you pay. Even your county manager is probably under that 200% AMI. And so that's what's really critical about putting an AMI cap on there. There are communities that have completely done away with AMI caps. I think for your first kind of go around in the first 2 years, stick with the 200% AMI cap. But again, you're the policymakers, you guys will help with this.
To clarify, what that does is help preserve the housing for families earning less. These aren't second homeowners coming in who may also have a job in the community. It's preserving it for the 2-teacher household, the teacher and the cop. That's who we're targeting, at least until we revise these guidelines.
And to answer your question a little bit further, you shall never, the guidelines will say, you shall never have a second homeowner or a vacation rental in any of your affordable housing. That is like, right, that's the 2 commitments.
Yeah, but they, I mean, somebody may have a second home somewhere else and is living here primarily.
They actually,
can't do that.
And developed residential property is a qualified standard. That one gets really, really tough. And that gets into the grievance committee when you start talking about someone who owns a second house, and where that always plays out is my parents passed away. I inherited a house in Ohio. I don't want to move back to Dayton, Ohio. Please, oh, please, oh, please, oh, please, don't send me back there because that's not where I want to go. But I don't qualify for housing because my parents passed away and I inherited the house. And that's when they can go to the front of the grievance committee and they can explain their situations. Some communities don't allow residential or you to own a second property in the county you which you reside or any of the neighboring counties. And then the third thing that normally happens if you do own property and you want to buy into affordable housing, you must sell that property to qualify. So 717. All right.
Can I ask a mechanics question to start out the difference between the tiers and the lottery? Just to make sure I'm understanding it right. So you basically, you would clear tier 1 before you go to tier 2. And the lottery only occurs if the tier is oversubscribed. Correct. Okay.
And I think one thing for me, just in with Housing Coalition, going through some of the guidelines, prioritizing those that live and work in Lake County. And say like a school bus driver works 2 hours in the morning, 2 hours at night, 4 hours a day, 4 days a week, 16 hours. Having some sort of criteria like that, must work 16 hours a week in live and work in Lake County, 16 hours a week or more. Might leverage someone that currently works out of the county to actually take a part-time job and use some of this as leverage so they qualify. And there are a ton of openings right now of these part-time, say, coffee shop and things where they just need a little extra help that to me makes sense to try to use some of this as leverage.
An example real quick though. I actually have a really good friend who became a bus driver to qualify for affordable housing and wound up serving as a bus driver for 10 years for that school district. Just because he wanted to qualify for affordable housing and loved the job.
I think there's so
They
many
want to become
openings
a
right
mayor.
now. We need to use whatever leverage we have.
I'm still hesitant on that point because most of our community who are, parents, don't work in this community, and those jobs that maybe you're encouraging them to pick up that part-time job, that's less time that they get to spend with their kids, that's less time that they, just to be able to afford a house for them, which, I mean, I'm sure you would know, related to school, parenting is very important to be, a fully grown adult, to be functioning adult, to have that parent figure really supportive. So I'm really hesitant to try to encourage parents to even further push themselves more. I feel like there's other solutions to that lack of in-community work that we should look at for that specific situation that don't necessarily involve housing, though I do agree that to some extent it should. And I think, a bus driver, I don't see why they wouldn't, if they're, for the school system, I don't see why they wouldn't qualify under that tier 1 anyways, since, to me, they would be essential workers, because otherwise how else are they gonna get kids to school? So that's kind of my worry, is that I don't want to incentivize people to do something that seems like it would have a consequence that would be much more harmful than, intended really. I would love to have more people work in the community, but I think there's different solutions to that than having that be, at least currently. Obviously, once we reach those numbers that are a little bit more equitable, maybe it's 50% of our communities working within community, we can start talking about really starting to change those guidelines. But until then, I see no reason to change those or to really have that differentiating because of the inequity with especially the Latino community.
So my only argument against that, and this is just something for the policymakers to consider, is that if you have a fire and you don't have any firefighters, you don't have anyone to come put the fire out. And that's when you go back to the essential services. We had a moment when I was the housing director in Crestview that we did not have a plow driver within 45 minutes of town. That is when you have to start making very difficult decisions around who is essential. Because I can tell you the buses that everyone takes to come into Crestview can't even get into town without that plow driver. We can't even open up the public works shop without that plow driver. So I'm just throwing out the side argument. I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I just want to make sure you hear both sides.
Yeah, would it that not be helpful to include that in the rental part as well, because I feel like a lot of the time what we see is, and maybe this is, you know, obviously the benefits being if we do include these people and have them be able to afford a house, maybe they're more incentivized to stay and work within the community. But I can just as well argue that there are community members who probably want these jobs, who don't have the experience because they don't have time or whatever to really start looking for this and say, okay, I need to work this job because I don't know, or sorry, I'm all over the place. There are a lot of community members, especially in the Latina community, who do want to work for this community because it would be easier for them for many reasons. And it's really hard for them to get these jobs because of experience and pay. On top of that, if they did end up having a house, it would, you know, building equity would be easier, not having to worry about that rent. It would be easier for them to maybe start slowly moving into those more local positions, which might include a plow driver, which might include a bus driver, which might include so many other essential workers that are very necessary. And I feel like it goes back to prioritizing people outside of the community. If we don't have a plow driver because they all quit, I feel like it'd be better to have them rent a unit and be able to affordably rent than own a house. Because owning a house, like, I don't know, it just feels unfair to those people in the community who want to grow themselves. It feels like we're kind of missing the point, in my opinion, like especially for their kids. If we want their kids to continue being here, usually the best way to do that is through housing. I live here because my dad just so happened to buy his house before any of this happened, and he can still afford to live here because he just happened to buy his house. I wouldn't be here if that wasn't the case. I mean, that's like a perfect example of, you know, I might be like an exception in terms of how active I am in the community, but like if we really want more people like myself, I would say incentivize those people who really grew up in the school, which most of them are Latina, you know, 70% of them, and most of their parents don't work in communities. So I feel like long-term and short-term, it makes sense to really focus on everyone broad because, you know, there's such a limited amount of people that work here. And then as, you know, as that starts changing, hopefully it does, we start changing those guidelines along with it. And of course, I think there's, you know, a need for bringing in specialists and all that. And I think renting should be where we really look at that because honestly, a lot of the times we get people through that revolving door, whether it's cops, whether it's firemen or whatever, a lot of the time they'll just end up leaving anyways, and they had not too much of an interest staying.
But why did they leave?
I mean, there's multiple reasons,
Well,
but yeah.
actually, most people quit their jobs because of their boss. And a lot of people,
That's true.
and a lot of people,
That is true.
in this community, they can get paid a lot more money to do the same job just over the mountain.
But the question,
So
but
you can get your training here and we can hire these people, and we can give them housing and they can access a home and then they can literally just go get a higher paying job.
Yeah, I don't
to
think
benefit.
them owning a house will exactly correlate to them then also working here. Like that's not all necessarily always true, especially if other counties are paying way more than what we are. At that point, we should just look at how much we pay our employees generally. And I think that's something we should seriously do if we really want to consider having more people working within town. And there's a lot of people who have lived here for years, like 20, 30, 40 years, who've never worked in the community.
okay, I'm gonna kind of, because we're running short on time, but I think your points are valid. What I want to get on, because we could, again, what you're doing today, which I love, is talking through really the quintessential questions. And I love it because your points are exactly the point of everybody's housing situation is unique. And trying to create a universal guideline and social engineer our housing program it doesn't work. But what this does do again is serve as a reference. So I agree with you. I'm not disagreeing with you. But I want to get on to the other major discussion points.
Let me ask one quick clarification. I understand the arguments you're making. Can you confirm if that means that you're arguing for option 1 or option 2? I think you're arguing for option 1 as Lake County based employee, or maybe a totally different option one, for Lake County resident,
It would be
for long-term
completely
resident
For
first.
me, it would be completely separate. I don't,
Thank you
I
for
think
clarifying.
we're advocating that community, people that have lived here for a certain number of years, 5 years, let's say, that they would qualify. I think that our suggestion would be that they qualify equally to people that that work in the
this
county.
end.
So it would kind of be, if you imagine
Okay,
top, priority, live and work in Lake County, right? Also, that's the best case scenario. And then in these situations, it's suggesting that essential services and then Lake County employees would be prioritized above people and families that have lived here for a long time.
So let's jump off of tiers, because I think.
thank you for helping me understand that. That
So,
was-
and I think as policymakers, they're hearing you, they're listening to what you guys are saying. Because you could completely not do tiers. That is an option. And you could just do lotteries based on years of that. We'll get to that here in a second. If you could scroll down to the next question, but I want to get into some other really nitty-gritty kind of important questions tonight. And the next big one is the appreciation cap. So there are there's three ways that communities around Colorado cap your value of what you're allowed to appreciate in your home, right? Obviously, if you buy a $200,000 home in Lake County and there's no appreciation cap, you can turn around tomorrow and probably sell it for $800,000 according to the MLS right now, which would not be what we do. What I want to show you are the two examples that I think for the short term are the best case examples is either to look at a 2% or 3% cap on appreciation. And I would love to get some direction from the policymakers. You can see that a 2% or even a 3% cap, you build equity in your home. It's not like affordable housing does not give you the opportunity to better yourself, better your family situation. In fact, I can tell you that I had a lot of folks that lived in my neighborhood when I moved to Crescent View, and I actually helped them realize that equity in their home by refis with these low interest rates. And they were able to pay, one family was not gonna be able to put their kids in college. They were actually refi their house and put their kids in college through the equity in their home and paid off a huge debt on a credit card. I mean, I've had multiple scenarios in my time of helping them through a refi and realize that. So that equity doesn't mean you have to sell your house to realize that. You can refi and take that money back out of your house because you only need 20 to 80% of the value. What's really important though, for the policy making decision point is for the policymakers to decide on a 2 or 3% cap. And we kind of need that direction to really kind of finalize the guidelines as we move them forward to consideration. And I wanted to give you tonight kind of the two examples so you can see how those appreciate and where you think it's equitable to cap it. But what's really important here is that you look at what does that mean as far as value, right? And where do they start, especially year 5 versus year 20, right? And when do they start to be able to realize that equity in the home? And so that's a key policy decision making.
I have one quick question.
Sure.
My worry with this is, looking at other surrounding communities, especially Summit County, does it make sense to only cap it through equity? Is there, I know the Housing Coalition's talked about this before, but is there not an AMI reference to that?
So there are other two, so there's 3 ways that communities do it. They do AMI, consumer price index, or just a straight percentage. The issue with AMI, I already hate AMI. The biggest issue with AMI is that AMI goes down. It doesn't always go up.
Right.
And if you think about it from a lending perspective, if you have 2 or 3 years of AMI going down, and I have an affordable housing applicant sitting in and I'm your underwriter as your loan officer, and I say, you're actually underwater. So now you have to come up with more money down to qualify for your loan. That is my big qualm with AMI caps, is because I've seen folks in a recession get hit really hard on their equity in their home based on AMI. Consumer price index is a little bit better because that actually goes with the ebb and flows of the economy, right? So when you see an increase in the economy, but the issue with CPI is now you get into a calculus formula and anybody who is in their home has no idea how much equity they actually have in their house. And that was the case for all those folks that I refied, they thought they were underwater in their loans because they had no idea if it was into a recession. And they were like, do I even have any value in my home? And I looked up this recalculation and I don't know. So I'm not gonna ask. So that's why I would tell you again, KISS, keep it simple, especially for the very first part of this, is that this is the best model I can tell you. If you go into the AMI model, I get it, but you have a real risk of putting folks in the community at risk on their value. So
Summit County told us that the 2% set them into a bad situation to be able to not qualify people anymore because their houses had appreciated to a point that they couldn't get sellers. They couldn't agree on maximum resale price.
So can we not have a dual system, including both a, which one's dependent on which one's lower?
you can,
No,
you,
so
you,
they recommended we do 2% or
AMI, whichever's less.
with the, but not to go
Well,
below on AMI.
I will tell you, this is the hard experience. I had a home where someone had lived in it for 20 years. And Crescent View, they bought it for probably about 287. And after 20 years, their value was actually 650. And I was like, there's no way it's gonna sell, and how's that affordable? I had 6 applicants for that home. That's where when you start talking about, the home will grow in value, and they were able to realize their equity. They had been, the gentleman that was a ski patroller, he was a teacher, his wife was a teacher. He got to the point where he couldn't live at 9,000 feet anymore, they needed to sell, he took his equity and they were able to retire. So you have to keep in mind that these are people living in their homes. You want to set them up for success, you want them to build equity. There is going to be a life limit of affordability on the home, and that's just the reality of affordable housing programs. If you try to over social engineer this, you're not putting the person in the home as a priority. And that's the biggest life lesson I've learned is I thought I could social engineer. I'm gonna have an 80 to 100% unit. I'm gonna have 120 to 100. It just doesn't. People's housing situations or personal lives are very messy, and so again, having a little bit more flexibility. But
and if that, oh my God, if that price was much higher, the city and county could also choose to subsidize, right, to meet a lower AMI?
Yep.
In the future?
And you could have, and the other case that you could have in some of these scenarios is that you start, and at Summit and Vail Valley, you're starting to see deed restriction purchase programs, right? So if you heard Vail and Deed, right, that actually, they offer for the deed restriction, they'll actually offer a percentage of the house price to go to the applicant to buy the deed restriction. Those are the types of programs that you're starting to see in these communities that have had housing for 20 years. Again, remember where you're starting. We're starting at year 1. That's where we're starting today. So that's why I'm saying keep it simple with the first draft of this and with your first round of housing. Because again, don't overthink the fact that the person that winds up in that unit, if you just put yourself there, you want to be micromanaged on your housing the rest of your life. You want to be beholden to, when you're 65, you want to be beholden to the fact that you have to live at 10,000 feet and that you can't move. And if you move, you only get $20,000 for a house that you've invested in for 20 years. I mean, those are the kind of things you have to think through because that truly does play out in a housing.
To clarify what this means is I buy a house for $250,000. If 15 years from now, kids graduated, can't breathe up here, want to sell. If I've capped at 15, at 2%, I can sell that for $325,000. I get the difference, and that's it.
No, you don't get the difference. You would actually get, because you've been paying on a mortgage for 30 years, you would have paid down your home.
Okay,
So you would actually probably wind up with, you probably would owe $100,000 on your home at that point, so you would wind up with $225,000
On the open market right now would be 700,000.
or more. These are brand new nice houses.
Do some communities, allow the 3% up to 20% or something like that? I think I read that somewhere. Is that not recommended?
You can, again, those are all,
It's more just putting stress onto the person in the future. The equity they're able to get out of that.
And future buyers.
in future buyers.
And future buyers.
Yeah.
So if,
so that was my next question, like, so I sell, it can only sell for 325 the next time?
They can only, it's that it starts
Or
out, it starts
It
out.
starts over at 250?
No,
No,
no, the buyer bought it for $325, they have a mortgage for $325, their 2% starts at $325.
their 2% starts, but so the home value has increased. It hasn't increased with the rate of the market, it's increased with the rate of the affordable community housing that we have set in place. They have less equity, but they got in lower.
and the way I see it, it makes the most sense, 2% personally, it's cheaper to afford, not obviously by a tremendous amount, but in the future, when numbers are way bigger, 2% and 3%, that difference, I would say, is probably gonna be a lot bigger. I feel like 2% makes sense for me personally. If we're gonna keep it simple, that's what I would stick to.
Okay. And then, to your point, comes into question too. I'm gonna answer this question for everyone. You absolutely should require a lottery on your resale.
I'm surprised you even put this in here,
Well-
you're so adamant about it.
Well, I wanna make sure, because you guys have done your homework, and you probably seen all the. I'm gonna mandate it, no, I'm just kidding. Lotteries, actually, the resale on these units, in 10 years, that unit comes back up, they're the most sought after units, because at that point, there's one home and there's 20 applicants. That's when the lotteries and the resales and these guidelines really come into full force. Because that's when it's like, that unit is 120% AMI unit, and I've been here for 20 years, I've been in 6 lotteries, I've never gotten a house, and I'm on my 8 picks, so.
Can you give them some examples about how it can go wrong and how people can manipulate it?
Yeah, so the biggest issue that you have is that if you're allowed to sell to whoever you want, and unfortunately, this is why I don't like, you make rules for the 1% of people who break the rules. But what has happened in other communities is that the listing price is $300,000, that's my resale. And my friend over there who wants that house, I have 6 friends that want to buy it. Well, one friend comes up and says, hey, I'm gonna give you a snowmobile and a $10,000 check if you let me buy the house. And no one will have to know about the snowmobile. It's cool, dude, just between me and you. And then you see the guy zooming away on his snowmobile. I'm telling you, it happens.
The other thing I
Has
do want to touch on is the equity portion of it. It's so common that a lot of the time our lower class and working class people don't have those same connections that other people might. So even if it is a fair, yeah, he's just my friend, I'm gonna sell it totally fair, even if they're, more middle class, but not necessarily rich or whatever. It's not fair to the lower class to not give them that opportunity to, start working their stuff way up the way that we intend our system to really work. So I would also strongly advocate for the lottery system on resale.
Okay, that's where like the 2%, 3% comes in, is if you're capping it at 2, you're restricting how much that homeowner can make over 20 years of investment.
Is there any, okay, I see it's, so Tracy, your question on CPI, I don't think the CPI model is a bad model. What I can advocate for is the fact that I had 9 different deed restrictions, I had all 3 months, I had to figure out. I will tell you the one I will absolutely adamantly go against is the AMI model, just because I've seen people get screwed out of a good situation. I don't want to put a future buyer. The CPI is a decent model and you can cap it at 3%. right? So you can't have more than 3%. But you start to get into the issue with CPI becomes, if the way it will read is CPI or 3%, whichever is less. So now you have to do, when Jackie goes to do a calculation, she has to do two calculations. She has to do the CPI and the 3%, and say CPI is higher. And she's like, oh, I'm sorry, you thought you had CPI, but you have 3%. And again, I think, you know, you're starting, we have 0 houses, right? It's one thing if you have an established housing program, you're starting at year 1. My suggestion, again, is keep it easy for the first couple lotteries. But I don't, yeah. Yeah. So Amy, that is a great question. So we can get into permitted capital improvements. We're doing great on time on there. Yep.
Oh, no, well, did you finish? My question was based on Amy's comment and wondering about the condition, like upkeep and condition requirement of the.
Yeah. So max sales price is what Amy's asking for, or what you just asked about. There will always be in every deed restriction, it'll say you can sell for this max sales price, but it's not guaranteed. Right? So I actually had a home that unfortunately a gentleman died in an avalanche and the town took on the home. I showed up 3 months after he was passed away and the electric had been turned off, the plumbing had been turned off, and the unit still had everything in the refrigerator. It was a wreck and it was unplanned. But when we went to resell that unit, right, we weren't going to sell it for the max sales price because it hadn't been painted, it hadn't been cleaned. I actually painted and cleaned it, but my point is that we reestablished it in that. So you're not guaranteed the max sales price. And then on permitted capital improvements, we'll get into that. I have a slide on that if we have time today to talk through that. But I do want to get to the lotteries. So the last one is going into your prioritization of years for that. The real decision-making point on this is that after 3 to 5 years, that's when you start to really build up your chances. So the folks that haven't been here for at least 3 years don't have those additional chances. And then you really start to prioritize the folks that have been in your valley. You can see how your chances grow exponentially as you've been here. The other two things that are a decision, I wouldn't focus.
Are those, is that living, is that working
Yeah.
or living, or is it?
It's between greater or less.
So if I've been working in the community for 7 years, but living in it for 6, it'd be the 7.
Whatever is greater.
Okay.
And if you're married, if your husband has been here for 15 and you've been here for 2, it's the household. It's the household. So it's not, you don't get to add it up. So if you're married, you don't get double the, but it's the person who has the most seniority. That's how you get it up.
And to Jeff's point, if tier 1 covers all the units and you're in tier 2, you're not even in the lottery.
That's correct.
But to be in the lottery, you have to qualify first, right? So
Right, so
it can take people up to 2 years to qualify. You know, I mean. Right, so if no one qualifies under essential workers, and fortunately all our essential workers are house trust fund babies who just want to live and work and let go, then it would go to a lower tier and it would go to first people, only people that can qualify are entered into the lottery.
Yep. And what I would say is I'm hearing the feedback that I'm hearing, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it is when we go back to the tiered system, it looks like the tiered system that the group would rather see is looking more at, well, I know, but looking at tier 1 and giving essential service providers the additional picks. Is that where you guys are
so
landing?
people who live here as tier 1.
Again,
Essential service.
instead of giving essential service providers the first tier as themselves and prioritizing them first above everybody else, which is fine, is instead of doing that, is to put them in with the rest of the tiers, but allow them 2 additional things. So that's compromise.
I'm not really leaning one or the other, I'm just asking, because
Sure.
it feels like the people that are underrepresented here, I just want there to be a voice for them, you know, in this whole thing. I know it's up to the governing bodies to make the decisions. I'm just asking them to look at it a more holistic approach and to prioritize people that have lived in the community for a long time, equally to people who are coming into the community and getting a job.
And the only other piece that I would add is that keep in mind that every time a project comes up, is they're gonna have their own vision.
Correct, and that's why I think that those people should, in the guidelines, if they were just equally aligned, that then it gives more leeway when you go and you're negotiating these documents.
The only other thing that's in the lottery mix that I'm a strong advocate for is that folks who take a qualified home buyer class get an extra credit. And that is hugely important to me because that's setting somebody up for success. If they go and they take, I always tell the personal story. I took a home buyer class, I was under contract, I took it and I learned about the amortization of the loan, and I backed out of my contract the next day. So I was like, what? You mean I'm paying 0? I'm getting 0% of my principal for the first 2 years because I only put 3% down? I thought this was like the greatest thing ever. And I'm paying mortgage insurance, which is like burning $100 bill for the first 10 years. What? And so I decided to walk away from the contract, and I built up and actually put 20% down and bought a house that way. But I am a strong advocate for that because if someone goes and they better themselves for doing that, there should be a motivation to do that. So whether or not the policymakers decide that or not is it's up for, that's my advocacy on that.
I really like that idea. I think that would additionally help us be able to get these people qualified, because those classes outline exactly what you have to do. And so I think that would be a great way to incentivize people to start getting qualified.
I haven't taken one recently, I would say yes. Definitely. Please include this.
So we got through, congratulations, we got through this 7:50. I want to check in. So one idea I had, and I want the Zoom folks, please chime in here to the chat. This is a very dense subject, but we do, because of the time frames, we do need to keep the ball rolling. What I would suggest is that I make myself available for a Zoom session where folks can continue to ask these kind of questions, and the electeds and the school board can educate yourselves a little bit more about the complexity of these issues before you see a draft. And at some point, we're going to have to put a draft forward. And again, because you have 2 bodies, I'm going to suggest that we kind of do the federal government approach, where the BOCC, since they're full-time employees, they are the House of Representatives, they get first crack, they send it to the Senate, which is the city council, and the city council makes and fools with it and sends it back to the House of Representatives for ratification. And I don't know who the president is because it's not gonna be me that signs it into law. But I think that is probably the best approach to how we get through the guidelines, and it's not 2024 when we're finished with it. So what I would suggest that we do is that I make myself available for our 6 to 8 p.m. time frame. We can do it on Zoom, so I don't have, so everyone can sit in their pajamas and ask me these questions and make sure that we kind of go through. I will do a meeting summary of some of the key policy decisions that you guys discussed. And we can make that available here in the more near term before we get in there. The next meeting that we really need to talk about, or the next really important piece, is who administers all this. And it's not Jackie, because Jackie is the staff person that goes through everyone's tax returns and goes through their voter registration and determines how many years and how many lottery picks. But the question is, what happens when I don't agree with Jackie's decision on how many lottery picks I was supposed to receive? And Jackie, the buck doesn't stop with Jackie. There needs to be a committee that oversees these. There needs to be what we're conceiving as a regional housing authority board, and we need to talk about the bylaws. The other really, really important piece of that conversation at the next meeting is the use of public lands, because currently the city code requires a vote of the people. And can you imagine that if you didn't like the person who won the lottery and you're gonna vote in November, whether or not they should receive their house, how nervous you would be trying to do that. So clearly that doesn't work. And so we need to have a conversation. And that is really, unfortunately for this room and for the folks on Zoom, that is really a legal conversation that we're going to be talking through with the attorneys to make recommendations on bylaws on how to structure that so that that board has the ability to potentially leverage property. What that doesn't include, though, from the legal side, is what kind of programs besides building new housing do we want? Do we want energy efficiency programs? Do we want home buyer classes being offered? What do we do at all the time that we're not building housing? Those are the types of things I want to talk through at the next meeting, different programs, and also talk about what would an eventuality of board structure look like. One of the biggest political hot buttons around a board that I'm talking about is you are deeding over potentially real property, very valuable property, to a board to make development decisions around. The county and the city are going to want to have votes on that board to ensure that the property is being used in the way it was intended to be used. And so there's some checks and balances on the board bylaws, et cetera, that we'll talk about at the next meeting around that. Really the legal nuances of how the board and their W-990, how they file it to ensure that they don't fall under the statutory requirement to put stuff out to vote. Those are the types of things that we're going to rely on legal, but the policies, those other things that we just discussed are what I'm going to be seeking feedback on. So that meeting is on the 21st, and that will be the focus. The remainder of this, we could talk about the things I didn't touch on tonight, which were permitted capital improvements, leave of absence, and some of these other questions that you kind of got into the nuances about like cleaning the unit. How do I get my max growth cell? I'm happy to do a Zoom call on. Again, those are very much based in the reality of best practices from other communities. As much as we could try to manipulate them, I would suggest you don't. You have communities that completely surround you that have been doing this for over 20 years. They have vetted those types of things. Those aren't things that you really need to get tied down in the minutia. The minutia that the conversation we had today is really, I'm really glad we had. I mean, that we hit the nail on the head tonight by vetting through and kind of pulling out of the weeds some of these critical questions like you brought up about how do we make sure that certain segments of the community feel like they have access to housing. That was the #1 goal tonight, and we did it. So a round of applause to everybody in the room for getting through that. I know it was very, very boring, but that is housing guidelines.
Michael, when we were speaking to surrounding counties, one of the things they advised us of is legal review should be done by a housing lawyer, not by a municipal lawyer. Is that the direction we're going to be?
Yep, so the DOLA grant has $15,000 for outside counsel for that.
Love it. Any help needed finding those folks or?
No, it was real quick, Chris Floyd and Christiana will actually make the recommendation on it. That's like great. So they're on it. They've been talking with Tim and Lori. And that conversation will go through BOCC ultimately and then council. But there's a technicality for whenever these guys go to outside council, their lawyers. So we will go through that step. All right.
I'd also just, like, if anybody's interested, if you don't have access to that housing action plan, which is really a good guiding document that's been provided to our community. You have access to that? If you don't have access to it, reach out.
I can send it to everybody who's invited tonight. It is, so for those who weren't involved, back in 2018, we had consultants come in and say, here are all the tools for housing, and then community members came together, elected officials, and people who live here said, I think that these are the best fits for our community, and that's where the housing action plan came in. So it is very much what we should be doing because.
Where's the website at?
It's being designed right now.
I'm hoping
No, that's great. I'm just asking.
late April, May, I'm really pushing it really hard.
No, it's cool. I'm asking for my own. Clicking ability. All right, thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chaffee.
Thanks, Zoomers. Thank you, Zoom.
Thank you.
Good job, Mike.